after the Berlin Conference, after colonialism, and because of independence, those original Africans, when they forged and tried to fight for independence, had an intention to collapse colonial boundaries, colonial borders. If you read very carefully Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, Sékou Touré, Patrice Lumumba, and these types of people, you find out, number one, they had no intention that Nigeria should exist, no intention that Ghana should exist, no intention that the Congo certainly shouldn't exist. They intended that there would be a United States of Africa. That was their intent. And that the African identity would be the identity that all Africans in Africa had, from Cape to Cairo, although not to quote Cecil Rhodes. That was the idea. It was not an intention that people should say, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Ghanaian, I'm this. What are you? That's not what it was about. It was creating an African identity forged in a global perspective. So, with that kind of thinking, it is very much lamentable that people of African descent don't have that African idea or that African identity. Instead, they say, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Ghanaian, I'm Congolese, I'm this, I'm that, without actually understanding how those terms came about, or even perhaps even caring. In the so-called Caribbean, the situation is far, 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 far worse. Because in the so-called Caribbean, African people, for the most part, although not entirely, were brought there by Europeans and others for the purpose of being labor. The status, the position that they had initially were as Negroes. They had no citizenship within the nations of the so-called Caribbean. Their position was as labor. White people refer to themselves as West Indians. After independence, some Africans of a certain status in the so-called Caribbean began to claim the given state in which they're in as their own. This happened in Haiti, actually, probably before anywhere else. That class of people began to refer to themselves as, I'm a Haitian, I'm a Jamaican, I'm a this, I'm a that, or something like that. The lower class people still, for the most part, regarded themselves as African. Their practices, cultural practices, the ways of living were predominantly still African. The way that they did things had reference points to the cultures from which they came from. But the higher classes were trying to forge a new identity that in some ways was distinct. So the adage was passed down from generation to generation. Oh, we're not African. We've changed. We're different now. Even some ways perhaps superior. Oh, those Africans, they sold us. That's the reason why we're here. Because don't you know, Africans sold other Africans. And this is something that was perhaps told by the overseer and the master to the slave. The reason why you're here is nothing to do with us. Your people sold you. Yes, master. We believe it, just like we believe in Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny and all these other things, and that's all a damn lie. Sorry to tell you that Father Christmas, the Easter Bunny, all of that is a damn lie. So why should we believe the latter? Or at least believe the latter wholesale. So that's an adage that was told, and therefore the identity was forged by Africans in the so-called Caribbean became a separate kind of identity in a kind of myopic oblivion, cutting ourselves off from an African root, disappearing in an island, in an ocean. This meant that for many people, we became devoid of culture. Our status was only determined by what was happening around us. This was a mistake, and ultimately has led to the situation that we now have. So the children of the so-called Caribbean, and the children of the continent of Africa, and the children of the African-American experience, and the children of the other American experience, in other words, the South American experience, and the children of the African-Asia experience, and the children of the African-Pacific, which is a different kind of experience, and the children of the African-Oceanic tradition, And the children of the African European experience are, for the most part, devoid of their own African root. Even those Africans in Africa are devoid of their own African root. So this poses a very severe problem for people of African identity, especially when all the other peoples of the earth are forging forward on their own identity and yet also forging forward in the place in which they live. British Asian people are very, very British, but also extremely Asian. British people, wherever they are very British, but they are also of the place in which they find themselves. Donald Trump is particularly German/British American. His politics, his rhetoric is particularly German, British/white American. His root, his culture, his language, his speech is particularly German, British/American. The white English Dutch South Afrikaners in South Africa, are particularly white English Dutch Afrikaners. Their Dutch and English origin and German origin gives rise to a certain kind of politics which only could be developed in South Africa. So the root from which they come from informs them in the place in which they're in. For all peoples. African people, by cutting themselves off spiritually from an African root, have lost the spiritual link that would enable them to survive even in the place in which they are then found. So by having no spiritual root, they're unable to develop the branches, trees, and leaf in the places in which they are found. They're unable to grow because they're a seed that's blowing in the wind with no root and no place. So when we say African, it's not to cut away from where you are. In fact, it's to enhance it.